to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast, where we explore the gospel that Jesus' earliest disciples heard and what the last several decades of historical studies have clarified about this first century Jewish message.
Listeners, welcome back to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. I'm Josh Hawkins. This is Season 3, and I'm once again here with Bill Schofield and John Harrigan. Hey guys, how's it going?
Howdy.
Hey, man. Okay. Overcoming COVID.
Nice. Glad to hear that you're better, though. It's a good thing. Well, listeners, it's great to be with you again. In our last episode of our season, this is Season 3, in our last episode, we spent some time looking at creation as a paradigm for redemption. So we looked at some of Genesis and specifically the creation narrative as how the creation narrative sets like a seedbed or a foundation for the expectation of a restored creation and where this is going in the future, specifically how it gets laid out in Jewish tradition, in Second Temple literature, and into the New Testament.
Yeah, because really you can't separate the restoration of new heavens and a new earth, the restoration theology, or restoration eschatology. You can't separate that from anything that the New Testament or even the Tanakh or Second Temple Jewish literature views as an end-time scenario. It's always tied together. And like even by the time you get to the New Testament, it's like it's just assumed. Like you think of like in Acts 1, we talked about in Season 1, how in Acts 1, eschatology gets embodied by the return of Jesus. Right, and that's when the restoration of Israel happens, and then later on it's assumed that the resurrection and the judgment and the kingdom happens related to the return of Jesus. Well, when Peter is sharing after the healing at the gate called Beautiful, he just says it as though everybody understands the expectation that repent and return so that God may send. This is like Acts 3:19-21. So that God may send the Messiah who's been appointed for you, and that he might bring the restoration of all things that has been foretold by the prophets. And so it's you can't separate this concept of restoration eschatology by the time you get to the New Testament.
Yeah, so today we're going to kind of continue our look at Genesis and look at the sin of Adam and Eve and the rebellion introduced there and how that plays out in Genesis 3, Genesis 6, and Genesis 11, where we have kind of a pattern of transgression and rebellion, which is then a limitation from God is introduced in response, and then you have a promise at the end. And this pattern kind of develops in Second Temple literature and ultimately placed within an apocalyptic framework.
Yeah. So with these three chapters in Genesis 3, 6, and 11, let's get into this. So Genesis 3, right? We I think probably a familiar passage to us, but I think we should probably start in Genesis 2 and just read a little bit here in Genesis 2 and Genesis 3. Genesis 2:17, I'll start here, where God is instructing Adam and Eve, and he says, "You can eat out of any tree in the garden, but the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, because in the day that you eat of that tree, you will surely die." Right? So God introduces this tree, and then eventually we know what happens in the very next chapter, Genesis 3, verses 4 through 6. They partake of the fruit, but we have the serpent here in Genesis 3, verse 4. The serpent said to the woman, "You will not surely die if you eat from this tree," because it says, verse 5, "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like the gods, knowing good and evil." So when the woman saw the tree was good for food and it was a delight to the eye, and the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. And the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. So here we go. The first transgression and rebellion that takes place in the story of the scriptures in Genesis 3. So how do we read this, guys? I mean, we've got this tree, and then we've got a serpent, and we've got fruit, and clearly there's a transgression of the boundaries here. So how should we look at this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the tree isn't mystical or magical. I don't think it's Gnostic as far as containing some esoteric knowledge in and of itself, but I think it represents a knowing, a functional knowing of good versus bad, and in that way, we might. The tree of knowledge of good and evil would be something along the lines of moral autonomy, knowing or deciding between good and bad, independent of God.
Right.
Yeah, I think all the tradition ultimately connects the decision related to the tree with rebellion. Or, like you said, moral autonomy. It's really choosing, and however the different ways of framing it, it's choosing independence from God. And you also have the bit where it talks about being one of us or being like us. Like the serpent in the temptation section, the serpent uses the language be like, and a lot of translation will say like God, but the Hebrew is ambiguous. It's God or the gods. Be like the gods. And which seems to be the case, because when you get down a little bit further in the chapter, God says they have become like us, and what's assumed there is that it's a conversation with the other divine beings, and so the point of the tree, really, to drive home the rebellion aspect, is that it seems to be that God placed them in a uniquely intimate and dependent relationship on him that was unique to even the relationship he had to other created beings like the angels and other divine beings, but that they were tempted to scorn that place with God of reliance and dependence to choose this sense of moral autonomy, assuming that if they were like one of the gods, that it would be that everything would be fine and dandy. But it did not go down that way.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and we get this theme that plays out a number of times where it's the scorning that is emphasized over and over again in Jewish apocalyptic literature, that Adam and Eve scorned God by this decision, and then it just gets worse. The nations scorn God and his rulership and his laws and etc. And so it's a progressive rebellion.
Yeah. Well, and this moral autonomy idea, I mean, the idea to discover and have this immortality independent of dependence upon God is what you brought up, Bill.
Yeah.
God had already given man a very special fruit from a very special tree by which they could have immortality.
Yeah.
And so in their rejection, man's rejection of that special tree called the tree of life and access to it, God's giving them access to it. This is, maybe we can do it another way. Maybe we don't have to have or try to be dependent upon God. We can have autonomy in and of ourselves. Our decisions to be able to navigate life in terms of things that'll be helpful and harmful for it, independent of God. Maybe we can do that. Of course, that's the transgression, to do it independent of God. And I think of Genesis 3:6, there's a key 3 words here in the Hebrew that are kind of like boom, 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 back to back, Genesis 3:6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that tree was desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit. So there's 3 words: saw, that it was good or a delight, and then she took. These 3 words come back to back to back really quickly, and we're going to see this throughout, really even in the next rebellion that we're going to look at in Genesis 6 as well, a pattern that Genesis is setting up to say, we need to be alerted that there's something going on here, and it's this typical pattern of let's rebel against God, and there's something here that's like, maybe we can do something independent of God for ourselves. And so those three words here in Genesis 3:6 are going to come up again in our look at Genesis 6. But yeah, just a quick preview of where that's going.
Yeah, so this whole interaction then, even though it doesn't, in the biblical text, it doesn't project to the future eschatologically, this interaction becomes kind of the basis in Second Temple literature for the judgment to come and the severity of it. So, like the life of Adam and Eve concludes at the end of the life of Adam and Eve in chapter 49, it says, "Indeed, 6 days after Adam died, Eve, aware that she would die, gathered all her sons and daughters, Seth with 30 brothers and 30 sisters, and Eve said to them all, 'Listen to me, my children, and I'll tell you that I and your father transgressed the command of God. And the archangel Michael said to us, because of your collusion, our Lord will bring over your race the wrath of his judgment, first by water and then by fire. But by these two, the Lord will judge the whole human race.'" So this whole interaction, sets up a tension that plays out eschatologically.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think even here in this reference, there's a little hint there at the end that listeners might be familiar with from passages like 2 Peter 3, where there's a fire that actually purges the earth. Eschatologically. So first by water and then by fire. Is fire being an agent of judgment. It's a big deal in the Second Temple literature. So here connecting the judgment. So this is, it basically is presenting it as a prophecy of Eve, right? She's just telling her what Michael told her. And then it projects forward to this judgment that certainly nobody had seen at their time. So they're seeing it still as future when Life of Adam and Eve was written. So it's just an anticipation that was built by the scenario in the Second Temple period.
Right. Yeah, that's really good. Another Second Temple passage I think of is from the Wisdom of Solomon. This is just in the Apocrypha. Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 24. Just another quick connection with Genesis 3 and what happened. But through the devil's envy, it just says, death entered the world. Right. And again, just another way that they reflect back upon the transgression of the boundary of not eating from the tree in Genesis 3 and how this gets projected forward and thought of throughout Second Temple literature. But, that brings up another question about the devil, right?
Yeah, I mean, you probably don't need to vamp on it for long, but like by the time you get to the book of Revelation, it's like a no duh that the devil is the one that deceived Eve, right? It's assumed, but that's not in the Tanakh. So once again, it's just one of the things that you have to understand is a reference to Second Temple literature that the apostles were familiar with, and so whether there's different versions of it, whether he was influencing the serpent or Satan was the serpent. Like there's other. Like in the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a serpent who's like half divine who talks, and so whether it's kind of that scenario or whatever, it's probably a little bit too much to go into. But the point is that the connection of Satan as the adversary of Israel with this serpent in the garden is made during the Second Temple period. And then, again, by the time you get to the book of Revelation, it's assumed as true.
Yeah, Bill, that's good. I mean, there's very little in the Tanakh that could make that connection. But yeah, by the Second Temple period time, definitely we see that. And I think there's bigger fish to fry in this chapter. Asking the question, did Satan just influence the serpent, or was Satan the serpent incarnate? Right? And clearly there's more important things in this chapter, specifically the limitation that God puts on humanity at this point. And the limitation is, of course, Genesis 3:14 through 19, this idea of the curse. But The biggest thing, of course, the most severe thing, seemingly, is the curse of death, right? Like, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return, Genesis 3:19. This is a limitation that he put. So again, the pattern we're looking at here is transgression, limitation, and then promise. Here we are, Genesis 3. The limitation is mortality.
Yeah, and I think mortality is you get it in a number of places, particularly in 4th Ezra and Book of Jubilees, where you have the description of 4th Ezra is more the complaint that it's Adam's fault that we have chapter 6 and 7, that we have all these problems and the suffering of this.
Thanks a lot, Adam.
Right. The suffering of this world is Adam's fault.
Yeah.
Jubilees, the Book of Jubilees is a fairly banal book that mostly just rehearses the Genesis narrative, but you do get some kind of insertions in the Book of Jubilees that are interesting, like in chapter 4 when Adam dies. And so it says, at the end of the 19th Jubilee, in the 7th week, in the 6th year, Adam died, and all his children buried him in the land of his creation, and he was the first who was buried in the earth. And he lacked 70 years from 1,000 years, for 1,000 years are like one day in the testimony of heaven. And therefore it was written concerning the tree of knowledge, in the day you eat from it, you will die. Therefore he did not complete the years of this day, because he died in it. And so that's how the chapter ends. That's how the narrative of Adam ends, is that the description of the tree of knowledge of good and evil is a description of the entrance of mortality, the introduction of mortality. And out of this description of mortality comes the whole chiliastic idea that with the Lord, 1,000 years or as a day, because of this description that in the day you eat of it, you'll die. And so chiliasm really is an exposition of mortality and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But it's directly tied together here. You also, get this idea in 4th Ezra 3, the same kind of idea, but from a different angle. And so Ezra is praying, and he's kind of recounting to God. He talks about, God giving Adam life, breathing life into his lifeless body and bringing him into the garden. And he says, you laid upon him one commandment of yours, but he transgressed it, and immediately you appointed death for him and for his descendants. From him there sprang nations and tribes, peoples and clans without number. And every nation walked after its own will and did ungodly things before you and scorned you. And you did not hinder them. But again, in its time, you brought the flood upon the inhabitants of the world and destroyed them. And the same fate befell them. As death came upon Adam, so the flood came upon them. But you left one of them, Noah, with his household, and all the righteous who have descended from him. So again, you get this idea that, God introduces mortality in light of the transgression and the sin. And this is kind of a pattern thing. They view it as a repeating dynamic that carries on after Adam. And this mortality is what spreads to all of humanity, because all of humanity is scorning God.
Yeah, that's good. Well, before we move on to Genesis 6, just to restate this pattern, right? Rebellion, some sort of transgression of the boundary, and then God institutes some sort of restriction or some sort of limitation. And here it is in Genesis 3, it's the curse. I mean, I suppose we could say that the curse is instituted by God to help men know their limitations, to help us understand, to humble us before God, to humble the pride of man in their exaltation of themselves in their own way. And then God, as we'll see, makes a promise. Of course, the promise is Genesis 3:15 of this descendant, this seed that's going to come and crush the head of the serpent, which we'll look at in a little bit. But let's move on, guys. Let's move on to Genesis 6, where we see again this pattern of transgression and limitation. And Genesis 6 is the story of the Nephilim, or the giants, or the weirdness that many people think of. So let me just read Genesis 6, 1 through 4. It says, "When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown." So here we get this reference to the Nephilim, Genesis 6:4. We get this seeming sons of God and the daughters of men thing. What's going on here, man?
Well, first we have to at least just mention. So the Nephilim is probably the biggest source of, let's say this, like people have researched the Nephilim, particularly here in the U.S., and tried to find every reference they could in Second Temple literature, probably more than any other passage or subject.
Yeah.
And it's where you get a lot of misunderstanding about Second Temple literature. So it's probably why some of you have never heard of a lot of Second Temple texts, is because there's such a culture of skepticism created by quasi-Nephilim scholarship, by just random dudes looking up text on the internet and walking away with a weird conclusion about Barack Obama. And so that's not what we're talking about.
Not at all.
But the Nephilim do have a part to play, especially in Second Temple literature. But it's actually about redemption and eschatology, and it really, believe it or not, doesn't have to do with U.S. politics. I know. Call me crazy, but so that just has to be said.
What about the angels? What about the aliens,
bro?
Bill?
Go on Amazon and you find like 500 books about the Nephilim and aliens, and
yeah, that's true. Yeah, I'm not an expert, so John, if you want to fill us in. Okay, if you have nothing to say about aliens, what about what's the storyline here? What's going on?
So what's really going on here? Well, this is number one. I'll say that this is the passage in the Jewish mind for sin, because what's going on here, the context really is Genesis 5, and man is carrying out their role to be fruitful and multiply. And there's something happening. One of our friends says they're sitting on death row. It's like, well, so-and-so is born, and then they died. And then so-and-so and bears so-and-so, and then they died. And then they died, and then they died. And so this is setting you up for Genesis 6, because man is succumbing to the curse to return to the dust, and this is what's happening. And so how do we gain immortality? How can man once again have immortality? And of course, just like in Genesis 3, they're trying to do it apart from God's ordained means, which is in submission to him through the tree of life and in obedience to his commands. And yet man is going, well, maybe there's a way that we can have immortality apart from God's way of doing it, and trusting him for resurrection and all of the things that ultimately he said he would do. Well, this is where this gets really interesting, because verse 2, the sons of God saw the daughters of men were attractive, and they took wives for themselves as they chose. Okay, and so this is really interesting, this phrase, they took a wife. This is really a technical term throughout the Tanakh for marriage. And the precedent comes from Genesis 4:19, where Lamech, it says he took two wives for himself. The name of one was Adah, and the other name was Zillah. And it's the same phrase here in Genesis 6. And so what's going on here in the sons of God taking a wife for themselves? Interestingly enough, there's no mention of rape or adultery here. And so the term to take a wife suggests consent on the part of both the daughters and on the part of the fathers as well, because in the ancient Near East, there is no such thing as a marriage without patriarchal approval. Okay, and so there is willing participation going on here between the daughters of men and the sons of God, or the gods, the Elohim. And so this is, again, a way of humanity's attempt to gain immortality by marrying with the gods.
Right.
And because there's no rape or adultery going on here, but this is taking a wife, I think this consensual and willing participation is a really important thing to see, that both man and divine beings are entering into this consent together.
Right, because otherwise the narrative seems confusing. If women get raped and God says, that's it, I'm killing all the people.
Right.
So it's a really important point, because the point is consensual. The point is that men were giving their daughters in hopes to supposedly, or what seems like the most logical thing is they connected the gods with immortality, and so they could prolong the race through that. Versus, because that's kind of the context in 6:1-4 is that all the intents of men's heart were only evil continually. And so they didn't have any, they had not cultivated any desires. As they grew in number, there wasn't a desire to follow God for the most part. And that's why Noah is going to end up standing out. And so like we just read above, the connection of the flood and the judgment by fire at the end of the age, it's kind of introduced here in the life of Adam and Eve, like John read. But you also have, again, connecting the judgment with this passage is 1 Enoch 16 starts, from the day of the slaughter and destruction and death of the giants, from the soul of whose flesh the spirits are proceeding, they are making desolate without incurring judgment. So that basically the spirits of the Nephilim are causing chaos, but they're not incurring judgment. But thus they will make desolate until the day of consummation of the great judgment. When the great age will be consummated, it will be consummated all at once. And so this is an important point within the development of apocalypticism, because it's not just this, what's prevalent now in a lot of Christian circles is kind of this progressive outplaying both of God's judgment and of his blessing. And so but this is the point, is apocalypticism is aiming here to explain history. Like, history is under chaos because of these spirits, these rebellious spirits. It's still like suffering from their influence and from their chaos that they're imposing on the earth. But don't worry, the day of the great judgment is coming. So even though they're not being judged like whatever, Sodom and Gomorrah, there is a great day of judgment coming, and it will be consummated all at once. And so this becomes like a huge kind of what apocalyptic eschatology is doing during this period, is they're explaining these things and how they're still working in their world at the time, but pushing it into the future as far as like when they can see the conclusion of that thing.
Right. And so the book of Enoch is actually 5 different books that end up getting tied together later on. And so the first book is really hyper-focused on the Nephilim particularly, and it's kind of an exposition that's pushing, because broadly the Jews are taking catastrophic events and they're interpreting them in light of their ultimate end. And there's no greater catastrophic event than the flood. And so, the first book of First Enoch, the first 35 chapters, is really focused on the Nephilim as the driver for the flood, which then is a precursor for the divine judgment at the end. The second book, the Similitudes, doesn't really focus on the Nephilim at all. And so you get in the second book, in chapter 65 through 67, you get a rehearsing of the flood narrative. But the issue there is idolatry and sorcery, which the two play together because both of them are a power grab for divine power to gain immortality or some sense of immortality. And so in chapter 65, Noah goes to Enoch and asks him, cries out about why the judgment is coming. And Enoch says, "An order has been issued from the court of the Lord against those who dwell upon the earth, and their doom has arrived because they have acquired the knowledge of all the secrets of the angels, and all the oppressive deeds of the demons, as well as all their most occult powers, all the powers of those who practice sorceries, all the powers of those who make images, etc., etc." And so there's it's in different ways it's presented as the people during the time of the flood are in rebellion against God. They're doing different shenanigans and means to gain power, to overcome mortality. And in the end, it's a cataclysm that deals with it. And this is a picture of how it's going to play out in the end, is it's going to come by cataclysm that's going to suddenly reverse it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. And that's a small point in the narrative, but it actually ends up kind of reinforcing the idea that Josh was mentioning about that when they took a wife, it was actually an illegal proceeding. It was voluntary, and it was, patriarchal approval and all that, because the idea of the sorcery and the mysteries of the universe a little bit earlier in Enoch are basically, they almost sound like they're a trade for women. They trade off, sex for these mysteries.
Yeah.
But understood probably more correctly as there's somewhat of a dowry given to the families in payment for giving their daughters away. So interesting idea that may actually reinforce the idea that it was voluntary.
Yeah. Yeah. It's good. It's good, guys. Well, of course, with this transgression of the boundary, both on the side of the gods, the sons of God, and on the side of the daughters of men and the fathers who gave the approval, there is limitation that God brings. And that limitation, of course, is the flood. But he also limits man's lifespan to 120 years. And this is, again, just emphasizing the frailty of humanity, even though maybe they have some divine attributes on the father's side or from the father's side, the offspring of these illegitimate, illegal unions are still just flesh, right? And so their lifespan is limited to 120 years because of the transgression. It's God's way of bringing this limitation upon man as a result of what happened here. So let's transition to our final bit here in Genesis 11, and let's briefly talk about what happens in Genesis 11. This is the Tower of Babel, of course, the famous chapter, right, where we think of, this is just a big leaning tower of Pisa, and it most definitely is not. And what happens here at the Tower of Babel is primarily what we see all over the world is like a ziggurat. And what's a ziggurat? Some scholars just call it simply a temple tower, which had a divine interface at the top in some sort of temple or altar, some way to access the gods. And again, this is the attempt of humanity to gain some sort of fellowship and immortality through the gods again.
Yeah, and that's an important point in the discovery, in the Middle East of the various ziggurats in that region was really big deal, because it brought, again, there was a time when this was also a little bit difficult to understand, how God didn't like big buildings, and so there's a big judgment on the earth. But that's not the point, or even possibly by the ambition to make a name for themselves.
Yeah.
But it's the point that the ambition to make a name for themselves, or essentially Essentially what this means in the ancient Near Eastern context is to make themselves great and powerful so that they were untouchable by damage. And the later Jewish literature, especially like in the Talmud and in Midrash, they play on, what's going on at the time. In fact, it's really hard to find a Midrash or any Jewish literature on the Tower of Babel that doesn't involve Abraham, because Abraham is always involved. There's like big battles between Abraham and Nimrod. There's Abraham pleading with the inhabitants of the earth not to build the tower. There's lots of stories, but the point in the narrative here in Genesis seems to be that they are wanting to make themselves untouchable, is the idea. They want to make themselves strong enough. And the way this is played out in later Jewish literature, like I mentioned in the Talmud, it's either in the Talmud or in the Midrash, is that Nimrod says to them, if we build a tower that's high enough, God won't be able to flood us again, and we'll still be able to live the way we want. And so that's not probably what's going on, but what they're picking up on is it's an act of defiance to basically live their own way, still living with this sense of moral autonomy, but to gain a sense of security from God's judgments and from relationship with the Almighty by, in this context, like you pointed out, the ziggurats, by building ziggurats, which it should also be said, this is the beginning of discussion in the Tanakh of idolatry. It doesn't happen before this. And so that they're building a ziggurat with a temple complex on the top, which is where the gods would, basically they would commune with the gods would inhabit that temple. And the idea is that by means of creating this portal, so to speak, for heaven and between heaven and earth, they would basically be able to preserve their lives and find a sense of immortality apart from fellowship with God again, apart from fellowship and submission to God and his ways. So this even the fact that the story begins with a coming together and presumably Nimrod kind of mobilizing everyone to come together to build the tower was, specifically an act of defiance, because Genesis 1, fill the earth, subdue it. Genesis 9, fill the earth and subdue it. And so it's in defiance of that they gather and try to build this temple complex to worship other gods in an effort to be safe, possibly from another flood or from God's judgment. Seems to be the case.
Yeah, and it's a super big tower. So the description in the book of Jubilees is awesome, where it says that they went to the plain of Shinar and they built it 43 years. They were building it. Its width was 203 bricks. The height of a brick was 1/3 its length, 5,433 cubits, and 2 palms its height rose up, which is like a mile and a half.
Gosh,
I think it's huge. And
it's a mile and a half plus 2 handspans.
Right, plus a foot. Don't forget the foot. And so it says, the Lord our God said to us, behold, the people are one, and they have begun working. Now nothing will escape them. Behold, let us go down and let us mix up their tongues so that each one will not hear another's word. And they will be scattered into cities and nations, and therefore one counsel will not reside with them until the day of judgment. And so you get, again, kind of the framing of the discussion in light of the ultimate end and the judgment, and that this is God's limitation on humanity to bring humility and to bring humility and repentance in light of the coming judgment.
Yeah. So transgression of the boundary, building the tower, God brings limitation in the form of scattering and a confusing of the language.
Right. So this is the scattering actually becomes a major point of the narrative as well. Sometimes, because Genesis 12 plays such a big role in intertextuality with the New Testament, Genesis 12 through 17, that Genesis 12 is often forgotten as, being the answer to Genesis 11 and the tower. And so, you have like a reference, there's a couple references that stand out. So in the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 10, wisdom, it's extolling the virtues of wisdom. Wisdom also, when the nations in wicked agreement had been confounded, referencing the scattering, the confusion of the tongues, recognized the righteous man and preserved him blameless before God and kept him strong in the face of his compassion for a child. Essentially talking about the election of Abraham as an antidote for God's scattering. That's kind of the idea that's introduced there. And so what's important here in God's judgment is that God's judgment is like the others, but this one becomes really, really central in the narrative, is that the judgment of the dispersion becomes incredibly central to the redemptive story. Because you have the scattering, Mike Heiser calls it the disinheritance of all of the nations, all of the families of the earth, because the commands to spread, fill the earth and multiply are not a disinheritance. Those aren't a judgment. Those were like God going, okay, now let's you guys need to fill the earth, and because this is how I intended things to go. But you have the disinheritance and the scattering that God actually did the confusion with the tongues bit specifically so they wouldn't be able to get back together again, right? So that's pretty clear. But the point is that they're disinherited, and Abraham's family is chosen so that ultimately they can all be brought back to God. But they're not going to come back to God except for through Abraham's family.
Right.
And so that becomes the reason this is so important in the narrative, is because of that point.
Yeah.
And another thing that stands out to me is currently doing an Acts study with some guys, and we just went through Acts 17. And so Acts 17 is unique because in the book of Acts, it's where you have the first and not the only, but it's the most detailed presentation of the gospel in a pagan context, where there's no referencing the Tanakh, there's no referencing the election of Israel to be a light to the nations or anything like this. It's just, we just got to give them the storyline. And one of the things he points out is when God divided up the nations and he appointed their boundary lines. And he says in his interpretation, again, along the lines of apocalypticism, is that he did it in hopes that those who were scattered would grope for him. He created conditions in hopes that they would grope for him, in hopes that they might find him, because God has appointed a day of judgment and a man by whom he's going to judge the world. And so he's actually importing this context of the dispersion and the scattering or disinheritance of the nations as a framework for explaining his presence as a Jew in this Athens courtroom, kind of giving an account for why he's teaching about strange gods and how they should forsake worshiping their own gods. And, because God allowed that for a time during this scattering, but now he's commanded that all men everywhere should stop worshiping idols in light of the day of judgment. So it's really hard to overemphasize the impact of Genesis 11, the rebellion, and then the scattering, and then Genesis 12 and the election of Abraham's family to eventually redeem the rest of them. It's hard to exaggerate that point, how central it is.
Yeah, Bill, that's really good. I know we did a little bit of an episode back in season 1, a shorter episode back on Acts 17. But I think it definitely at some point in the future, we probably will revisit it and make even more of these connections. But yeah, that's really good. Well, okay, so we've talked about a transgression of the boundaries, we've talked about rebellion, and we've talked about the limitation that God brings as a result of Genesis 3, Genesis 6, and Genesis 11, the garden and the Nephilim and the interfacing with the gods at the Tower of Babel. And the point I think we made right at the beginning was that God always gives some sort of promise in the midst of this rebellion and the limitation that he brings. And so, of course, the promise that we see in Genesis 3:15, after the judgment of the curse and returning to the dust and limitation of the access to the tree of life, is that an offspring is going to come and crush the head of the serpent and bring the restoration. Of course, this gets played out throughout the rest of the Tanakh and into Second Temple literature and, of course, into the New Testament. This is one of the biggest driving themes of the scriptures. Genesis 9, right after the flood and the Nephilim in Genesis 6 and Genesis 7 and Genesis 8. Genesis 9, you get the covenant that he makes with Noah and his offspring and all of the rest of the living creatures. Like, God makes a covenant with Noah and the ants and the flies and the rhinoceros and all of the living creatures, that he would never again flood the earth and bring that kind of cataclysmic judgment by water. And then, of course, we talked about already how the life of Adam and Eve, as you referenced earlier, guys, like, this is going to, of course, there is a judgment by fire that is still coming. And of course, that gets echoed throughout Second Temple literature and into even the New Testament in 2 Peter 3. Now, the promise that God makes in Genesis 11, or as a result of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, is what you just alluded to, Bill, which is Genesis 12, 1 through 3, and God establishing his covenant with Abraham. And this is where and how the Jewish narrative of the Bible unfolds and how this gets played out into Second Temple literature and into the New Testament. So these rebellions seem to function in so many ways to both humans and the divine beings, to the boundaries that God has fixed from the beginning. And this is really setting up what we see with Abraham and the unfolding of the entire Jewish story, and where this is going, not just in terms of the Jewish story, but in terms of the blessing being brought back to the rest of the nations, how immortality is going to be restored to humanity through the family of Abraham. And of course, this is what we will begin to tackle even more in our episodes this season. Well, before we conclude today, I just wanted to make sure that you're aware of an excellent resource from some of our friends in the ARC network, both David Gordon and David Rickman. If you want to go deeper in specifically these subjects of what's going on here in the early parts of Genesis, we would definitely highly suggest this class and extra discussions by these guys.
It's great.
But their website is thearcnetwork.org, and we'll put a link to it in the show description, the show notes here, so that you can check it out. But highly recommended. But well, John and Bill, great to be with you guys. Listeners, thanks again for joining us. We look forward to making more progress through Genesis and discussing more of the narrative of Abraham continuing next week. So until then, God bless and Maranatha.
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 Thanks for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. For more, visit us on our website at apocalypticgospel.com and follow us on Twitter at Apocalyptic Gospel.